Imagine growing up in a world where you are taught that your own people are the only good ones, and everyone else around you is bad. I grew up in such a world. Let me tell you my story. I'm Ridvan Aydemir, also known as the Apostate Prophet. I was born in the south of Germany into a Turkish Muslim family of immigrants. My parents became very religious around the time I was born, and are to this day very religious and observing. They were never fundamentalists, but they became part of a Sufi order within Sunni Islam that is very fundamentalist in their religious rules, and to extents revivalist and apocalyptic. They were also very strict in terms of interfaith relations, and greatly imitated the intolerant message of Islam. I was taught very early that Islam is above everything, that Jews are mostly our worst enemies, that Christians are deceitful and immoral, and other religious groups? Well, all of them are infidels and enemies of Allah. I was never allowed to listen to music, although I always loved music more than pretty much anything. I was strictly indoctrinated with the fear of eating food that is not halal, which is not restricted to meat. Not to have any close relations to the other gender, not even my cousins. That I could go to hell for pretty much anything, because in Islam even Muslims can go to hell. But most importantly, that the end times are likely close, and that especially in this time, all the non-Muslims were not to be trusted. All of these are Islamic teachings. Even in early childhood, I, my brother, my cousins, and many others that I knew were indoctrinated with end-time prophecies, intolerance, and fear. Just imagine, I was only in second grade, but I was taught that the Jews will fight the Muslims in the future sometime, and the Muslims will slaughter them with the help of Allah, and they will go to hell. I know many Muslims say at this part that the prophecy is Jews fighting Muslims, but if the fundamentals of your religion say that Jews will fight you and you will beat them, how tolerant and positive can you really be? You can't. I wasn't either. I went to a Catholic kindergarten because it was the only one that was close. I was so indoctrinated that one day we went to the adjacent church in kindergarten and I freaked out and started screaming and crying so that my father had to come and pick me up. I freaked out not because I had weird ideas that children have, no. I freaked out because I was taught, as Islam teaches, that churches are the houses of the devil, and that only immoral Christians who worship the idol of the cross go there. I didn't even know what that means. I didn't even understand it. I just knew it's bad, it's evil. I can't go in there. Allah will be angry with me. I don't want to go to hell. Throughout the years in Germany, as a child, as a teenager, I didn't really abide by the teachings and the rules that my parents gave us through their religiosity. I loved Germany. I loved the culture and the way people live and think, how everyone is free and educated. I also went to a higher grade of school that is fuller of non-Muslims than by underachieving Muslims. So I had consequently mostly non-Muslim classmates and friends. I received some Islamic education in Germany as well. Quran courses and Turkish Islamic education funded by the Turkish government. There I heard all the time how bad Christians and how bad Germans are, how bad non-believers are, how immoral they are, and that they are what they eat. But I was mostly resistant to such thoughts. Things became a bit weird after 9/11. Now it was all over the news. Islamic terrorists commit the biggest attack on American soil. I was terrified to see the second plane fly into the building. My mother, she thought it was definitely the Jews themselves. She thought that right when it happened and she was convinced. At that time, I also saw something pretty disgusting. I said this before, I'm saying it now, and I will keep saying this in future, and I'm not sorry. Most Muslims I knew were either happy, thought 9/11 was an inside job, that it was done by the Jews, for the Jews, or said things like, what about all the tragedies in the Muslim world? Why don't we think about them? Funnily, on the outside, most of them were sorry about what happened. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just pointing out a toxic way of thinking that is sadly seen among people under the umbrella of Islam. In Germany, I saw also many other things, like that racism, as people claim, coming from Germans is pretty much non-existent, while in our communities, among Turks and other Muslims, it was pretty normal to call Germans pigs and immoral and infidels, and curse their country and their flag, while if anyone said anything remotely insulting about our culture, about our background, that was immediately racism. A rejected job application because you don't qualify? Racism. Someone doesn't smile at you? Racism. You have to go and pay taxes? Racism. The funny thing is that I actually believed in those things until I went to Turkey and saw racism with my own eyes. During my education and my life in Germany, I really enjoyed living there. Especially the last year in Germany was probably one of the best memories in my life. But Islam was always in my way. Although I saw teachers when I went to school, in the back of my mind, those were just Christians, non-Muslims. I was also supposed to see women as lower people and could have ended up being pretty much disrespectful against women. And I have observed the same thing in many others, which is no surprise if your religion degrades women to such an extent that the Quran says men are above women and men can beat their wives, men can marry 4 wives. I always loved women, I loved girls, I thought they were just so much more likable. But as said, Islam was always in my way. It was an obstacle, and it also cut my path in Germany and ended it. In 2006, my parents came up with the brilliant idea to move back to Turkey, although I and my siblings were born and raised in Germany. I was so sad that even my teachers gathered and invited my parents to school and offered them a solution in me staying in Germany. I'm very thankful for that. I asked my parents too if I could stay in Germany until I can get my German citizenship. My parents rejected both of these thoughts. They also didn't allow me to go back to Germany afterwards. And after spending a year in Turkey without going back to Germany, I was also officially not allowed to go to Germany without a visa anymore. I wasn't allowed to go to my home country anymore. My parents did this not because they are great schemers. They did this because Islam teaches that Muslims can't and shouldn't live in non-Muslim lands. A Muslim is only allowed to live in a non-Muslim country temporarily, or if he wants to spread Islam through invitation or war. I was very distant to the culture in Turkey and didn't like living there at all. I tried adapting, but it never worked. I just had a completely different way of thinking that I received in Germany. Especially concerning women, I hated Turkey. In my world, women were equal, strong, independent, loud like me, able to do whatever they want to do, and happy in life with equal opportunities. In Turkey, most people thought a woman should obey her man, her husband. Women should be quiet, modest, not aspiring to be independent and strong like men are. Extremely sexualized. I was always shocked to see people blaming rape cases on the victim because the victim wore shorts or a skirt. I just couldn't understand how these people are viewing the world. I was in an identity crisis. At first I met nationalism, Turkish nationalism, and rejected it as soon as I understood it and saw how nationalists in Turkey are. After a while, I became interested in communism and the idea of revolution and independence, fighting global imperialism. And I was actually part of that and joined a youth organization of an illegal terrorist organization in Turkey. But after studying communism thoroughly for 2 years, I thought it's unrealistic and nonsense. I spent my first 4 years in this identity crisis, and then my aunt, who was very close to me and who was still in Germany, was shot dead by her husband, whom she picked from Turkey and married. It was an example of an honor killing. She was an independent Germanized Turkish woman. He was a traditional Turkish man. He became jealous over everything, threatened her a few times. And when she didn't want to put up with it and initiated a divorce, he killed her. This incident could have moved me away from Islam, but it didn't. The opposite happened. I became religious. I started studying Islam, learning it and loving it, spending my whole time with it, trying to be the best Muslim that I can be. I sacrificed my freedoms, all the things that I grew up with, that I loved to do. I spent day and night praying to Allah, offering my respect to Muhammad, and strictly going in their path, while also trying to preach to others. I was so devout, so religious, and so much in love with it. I read the Quran in Arabic and learned how to properly recite it. But then I also wanted to study the Quran and understand it. So I took one certified approved translation, a Turkish translation of the Quran, and had a few other translations and a German one as references with me to compare them. The first time I read the Quran, I felt that my faith was a little bit shaken. First off, the Quran is very poorly structured. Multiple things are repeated over and over and over and over again. Mostly, the Quran just throws threats around and talks so confidently about how it is right, and all who disbelieve will burn. The Quran is extremely intolerant and aggressive in its language, so that it threatens Christians, Jews, and Arab polytheists, and along that all others who reject Allah, while in many parts it orders to be intolerant with them and to fight them. The Quran's view on women was completely contrary to my view of women. I don't think I have to expand much on this one. And my faith was a little bit shaken about how the Quran contradicts with how we observe and document the world around us. After the first time I studied the Quran, I started having many doubts about Islam, but I suppressed them because my belief was so strong, my fear was strong, and so was my love for Islam. I couldn't stop asking questions, however, but never received satisfying answers. Some people suggest that you should read the Quran with an exegesis, an explanation by an Islamic scholar. But I disagreed back then, and I still disagree. Because exegesis were something of the past, where people didn't have the internet. Now in our time, you can find any information quickly on the internet. And if you know how to use this wonderful technology, you won't need any explanation for anything. Just use your mind and your fingers. One of the things I came across in the Quran was the sun setting in a muddy spring. And although there were so many apologetics by Muslims about how we need to understand this Quran verse, they were just not telling the truth. I was a strong believer in Islam, but I couldn't accept those vague explanations that people make to defend Islam. They were simply defending Islam. This issue bothered me for years, until I left Islam. I made a video about it very recently if you're interested. At some point, I talked to an atheist in Turkey at school, and when I tried talking to him about Islam, he said something surprising to me. He cited a Quran verse, chapter 33, verse 53, and said, in that Quran verse, Allah orders the Muslims not to sit too long in Muhammad's house, and not to bother him too much, to get up when they are done with whatever they are doing, and not to marry Muhammad's wives when he dies. He said, did you see that? If you read that, you'll probably laugh out of your ass. That's Turkish slang. Of course, the way I am, I looked it up immediately once we left our conversation. When I saw that, I remembered reading it but not thinking about it. While I tried to reason with the background of this Quran verse, but found it quite weird, I decided to read the Quran again and pay more attention. I didn't allow myself to get weaker and lose my faith, because Islam taught me one thing. Don't even dare to question anything, or to think about questioning, because Allah dislikes those who question, and doubts are inspired by Satan. So I decided to read the Quran once again, and I paid so much attention this time to what I was reading. I had so many questions now, and I tried to find answers to them. I started thinking about them one by one. The Quran contradicts itself very often. In one part, it says that Jews and Christians won't have to fear anything when they die. At later parts, it suddenly promises hell to both Christians and Jews. Muslims explain this by later verses invalidating earlier verses. But what exactly happened there? Did Allah first accept Christians and Jews into heaven, then he decided to send them all to hell? I was also stuck on women's issues again, since the Quran explicitly degrades them massively and allows to beat wives, something that I simply couldn't accept. That's not a cultural difference. If you think so, think about it differently. Islam is a religion that wants to spread globally to all humans, and it has such a view of women. In the West, women are considered free and equal. Now, if a woman in the West converts to Islam, she regresses towards a state where she can suddenly not be equal any longer and can be beaten by her husband, something that is strictly forbidden in the West. Why did Allah allow other cultures to give women a higher grade, more rights than His own true religion does? How can it be that the Almighty God creates a system where He takes free humans and makes them less free, less dignified? How can that be? Apart from that, the Quran is very problematic about science, about the world around us. The Quran's description of the sun, the moon, and the earth are insufficient and false. They are ridiculous. The Quran lacks words on the universe, other planets, our solar system, everything outside of it, and so many other things that humans learned by themselves, not from Islam. Shouldn't the Almighty Allah be telling us about these things, especially when it claims to be perfect and enlightening, and Muslims claim it has all the answers to the world, to all the questions? And of course, the intolerance in the Quran. When I was a child, I learned that Jews are deceitful, evil plotters. I learned that Christians are not as bad, but that they are perverted transgressors. I also learned that pagans are filthy enemies, and they don't deserve to live freely in happiness. All of this is not a surprise, not a coincidence, nor an isolated case. The Quran teaches the same thing, and uses the same words. At the same time, I saw so many other things, like that Islam lives in people based on myths. There are so many myths in the Muslim world that people blindly believe in, that strengthen their faith, such as that the world is converting to Islam, that Germans are converting to Islam, that the Quran is scientifically approved, Quran miracles like the splitting of the moon, or that this and that celebrity converts to Islam, or that Islam was the only culture to encourage the freeing of slaves or treating them well. Most Muslims believe in at least one or two of these myths. The name says it already. They are all wrong. Islam spreads by high birth rates, not by conversion. Most scientists who talked about the Quran consider it just that, a religious book of no significance to science, and mostly wrong. The splitting of the moon was never observed and proven. It was in fact rejected by NASA. And celebrities? Most of them did not convert to Islam. And Islam was not the best with slaves. Even the Romans and Zoroastrians, both enemies of Islam by the way, were better in the rights of slaves long before Islam. At this time, I started thinking about so many issues in my mind. If this religion is so much superior, how come we have serious moral and rights issues in the Islamic world, while the West is still at the top of mutual respect and tolerance, human rights, and the treatment of minorities? More importantly, how could the Quran be so insufficient, so evidently inaccurate about our world and the objects around us? How can the Quran talk about the sun running in an orbit with the moon, when in fact we are running around the sun? The sun doesn't move around us. How can the Quran describe stars as little shiny objects close to us, when in fact stars are huge objects like our sun, which is a star? How can the Quran describe the sun sinking in a muddy spring? How can the Quran order people to fast from sunrise to sunset, when in many places of the world, either one of those events doesn't happen for weeks or months? Why does it seem like the author of the Quran wasn't really familiar with the world beyond the Arabian Peninsula? I was getting more and more into a dilemma. I could never blindly follow something without properly learning, understanding, and being able to explain it. And it became clearer to me over the years that that was a problem with Islam. I had to go to the military service in Turkey and had a lot of time there to think about my faith and everything. I hated the military. It was just not a place for someone like me, but it helped me lose my faith. Even when I was frightened to death of questioning this religion, I thought, I am a human. I have a brain. I need to use it. I need to dare to think. How can I be blamed for questioning something, for not blindly believing in it? How can I be blamed for using my brain, my mind, which the Quran tells me to use? A brain that Allah gave me. How can I be blamed for being a faulty, a flawed human in front of a perfect God, an almighty God who put me on this path? Speaking of faulty humans, how can I trust that some Arab guy in the 7th century told the truth? A man in the 7th century who didn't write anything, whom others took notes of, people who didn't even see what he claimed was true. While humans are so faulty and can so easily be selfish and deceitful for their own gain, how can I trust that he was telling the truth about life and about God? I thought all my life I have been a good human. I have respected others, their rights. I have never wished bad for anyone. I never hated. I have forgiven people and seen them as my equals. I'm sure Allah wouldn't blame me if I was wrong. I did my best. And once I had the courage to question my religion, it went downhill for my religiosity and uphill for me. I was bound to lose my faith. At first I left Sufism behind. Then I moved on still believing in Islam. But almost a year later I also left Islam. So many questions in that time just didn't leave me alone. I didn't need to have sex with as many women as possible. Thinking about the fact that Islam promises sweet, juicy virgins in heaven for the believers, I thought that's an odd promise. It almost looked to me like Muhammad was promising something nice to men in the 7th century. But I thought to myself, could I ask Allah not to get those things? Because I don't need them. Or does Allah know better than me? I really had this question in my mind. I didn't want virgins. It took a while until I realized that I was just more moral than the Almighty Allah. I just couldn't express that until I quit believing. Also, why do I have to do everything in Arabic? I speak German and Turkish, which is not my fault. Why are we praying in Arabic, taking Arab names, dressing the Arab way, reading our book in Arabic? Why does the belief in Islam come with Arab cultural imperialism? That can't be right. And what about jihad? Allah, who is the Almighty God who created us all, us flawed humans, really orders his followers to spread Islam by the sword? To kill apostates? Flawed humans kill other flawed humans for their perfect God? If you're a Muslim, dive into this thought, be honest to yourself, and dare to think. I even read the Quran a third time, to be sure, but this time I just had so many more questions. It was just too much. I still remember how one day my brain was full of thoughts. I was captivated by another monologue in my head, and then I made my decision. I gathered myself and my courage and said, I don't believe in Allah. I don't believe in Islam. I'm not a Muslim. I did it. I was a bit scared, but suddenly more confident. But now it was a time for something different. Remember what I thought of the Quran? It was time for me to study the books of Christians and Jews, because I wasn't yet sure if God really exists or not, although there wasn't really much to hold on to. The first thing I noticed when I read the Bible, the Old Testament, was how different it is from the Quran. Much better organized, much easier to read, much better to understand, free from weird repetitions and rhymes at the end. Why is Allah rhyming in the Quran anyway? The Bible tells relevant stories, talks more about how God guides his people. In the New Testament, he loves the people. In the Quran, he's suddenly some problematic dude who is just damn angry at the world, so much that the majority of the Quran verses talk about blood, hell, infidels, punishment, fire, hell, and again, hell. Moreover, when I noticed the contradictions between the Quran and the Bible, I saw further that there was something wrong with the Quran. Muslims claim that Christians and Jews were once believers of Allah, then they abandoned that path and falsified their scripture. But why would they do that? All of them did? Sorry, that makes absolutely no sense. Why would an entire religious group choose to falsify their own books and follow something wrong while they believe in God for no reason? Do they all want to go to hell? Can you really believe that? And if they really managed to falsify their books, all of them, and forgot everything, how did they manage to remove the Kaaba from the Bible, which the Quran claims was Allah's most important location and building in this world? How is there no reference to the Kaaba at all in the Bible? How are so many things clearly allowed in the Bible, although they are strictly forbidden in Islam? Why don't Christians and Jews pray like Muslims do? What was the purpose of Christians and Jews? If they were all followers of Allah at some point, they were all Allah's people. But at some point, the vast majority of them went astray and never converted to Islam. Then what was exactly the point of Allah choosing those two religious groups and making them so great? Did Allah play with the Christians and Jews? Even if the Bible was falsified by Christians and Jews, and evidently it wasn't, then what's the fault of Christians and Jews in our time? How can they trust Muslims when Muslims say, you're following a wrong religion and your Bible was once falsified? Why would they choose to trust Muslims and the Quran and reject their own religion, their own faith, their own holy books? If you were in their position, would you do that? Anyway, before I left Islam, I thought about the consequences of leaving Islam. If I'm wrong, I'll go to hell forever. Well, if Allah wants to do that to me, then so be it. What was more offensive is that if I was in a country run by Islam, I would get the death penalty for my apostasy. Really? Allah wants me killed for thinking? For making a different choice in life? A flawed human? He wants me killed? Well, then so be it. Later I became much more confident. At first, when I lost my faith, I felt joy and happiness. Then I went to a deep and long phase of depression, since everything I lived for was suddenly gone. The ground under my feet disappeared. My dear God was a lie. I became hopeless, sad, depressed, angry. I wanted to commit suicide, but I didn't. I wanted to define my own life and my own purpose from now on, and live for myself, for the people around me, for the world. I want to help make my life better, make people happy, help create better lives, and help others. And once I left Islam and started being independent, my whole view on life and everything changed. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking and trying to be impartial and fair, I developed a far better sense of right and wrong than what Islam has given me. And I feel so much more at peace with life and everything that happens in the world. I left Islam and I'm happy, happier than ever. I don't need Islam telling me what to do and what not to do. With the one life, the one brain, the one body that I have, I can't buy any longer that my almighty creator gives me restrictions, like don't eat with your left hand, don't wipe your butt with your right hand, don't lay on your stomach, don't eat this, don't drink that, don't talk like this, and don't talk to those. Don't greet those people. I'm a much better decision maker than Allah has been, and so are you if you start using your mind freely. Think for yourself, respect people and their humanity, and take empathy rather than a poorly written 7th century poetry book as your guide. My suggestion would be to always question everything, no matter what it is, no matter who's talking to you. Be rational. Trust your eyes, trust your ears, your hands, your feet, your nose. Trust your brain. Think about the future of humankind and the development of humans. Use your mind. Read and learn the things that you believe in. Be open-minded. It shouldn't take long until you come to the same conclusion. Allah is not real and never has been. Allah was just an idea that is obsolete today. Allah is not with you. Allah is dead. Thanks for watching. Being a freethinker and caring more about thoughts and about others, about tolerance, also helped me create this YouTube channel. I discussed many of the points raised here in separate dedicated videos, and will continue doing so. I'm also preparing a book and many other things. If you want to support my cause, you can support me on Patreon. The link is below in the description. Thank you all so much for your support. And as I always suggest, without carrying any hate, any aggression in my thoughts, stay away from Islam. You will be happier.